Welcome to Readings in English, the channel dedicated to helping you learn English through captivating stories. We know that learning a new language comes with its own set of challenges and difficulties. It can be frustrating to understand new words, grasp grammar rules, and feel confident in conversations. But here we make that journey easier and more enjoyable. Through incredible educational stories, you'll not only improve your English, but also immerse yourself in experiences that make learning fun and meaningful. Today's story takes you to a unique school in a country where English isn't the first language. In an effort to help their students practice English, the school organizes a virtual cultural exchange program. Students connect with American peers through video calls, where they share stories, traditions, and learn from each other. These video calls become more than just a language exercise. They turn into friendships that break down the barriers of language and culture. Stay tuned to discover how these connections shape the students' understanding of both language and the world around them. The soft hum of the school bell echoed through the corridors, signaling the beginning of another day. For most students, it was just an ordinary morning, but for a small group, today marked the start of something different. The school had announced a new initiative, a virtual cultural exchange program. The idea was simple yet bold. Students would connect with peers from an American school, practice their English, and share their experiences. For the students, this was an opportunity, but it also came with anxiety. In a classroom at the end of the hall, the protagonists sat quietly at their desk, nervously tapping a pencil against the edge of a worn notebook. They had always been shy, especially when it came to speaking English. The thought of joining a video call with native speakers was terrifying. What if they made a mistake? What if everyone laughed? These thoughts raced through their mind, clouding the excitement that the other students seemed to feel. When the teacher entered the room, the atmosphere shifted. She was a kind woman, always encouraging her students to push beyond their limits. But today, even her smile couldn't shake the nerves that filled the air. "Today is the first call," she announced, her voice calm and steady. "I know many of you are nervous, but this is a wonderful opportunity to learn and grow. Remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about communicating and connecting." The students exchanged glances, some smiling nervously, others avoiding eye contact altogether. The protagonist, however, kept their eyes on the desk, wishing they could disappear. The teacher began setting up the video equipment, explaining how the call would work. The screen at the front of the room flickered to life, revealing a blank interface waiting to connect. The protagonist's heart pounded in their chest. It was too late to back out now. The sound of the connection ringing filled the room, and suddenly faces from across the globe appeared on the screen. American students, smiling and waving, greeted the class with a cheerful hello. Their voices were confident. their English perfect. The protagonist swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in their throat. The conversation started slowly with awkward pauses and hesitant smiles. The students introduced themselves, but the protagonist stayed silent, too afraid to speak. Minutes felt like hours as the conversation continued. The protagonist's mind raced with thoughts of what they could say, but every time they opened their mouth, the words stuck in their throat. The other students seemed to handle it better, though they, too, stumbled over words and grammar. It was comforting, in a way, to see that everyone was struggling, but it didn't make it any easier to find the courage to speak up. Then something changed. One of the American students, noticing the awkwardness, began sharing a story about a local festival in their town. The story wasn't anything grand, but it was simple and heartfelt. As they spoke, the room seemed to relax. The protagonist listened intently, feeling the tension in their body ease ever so slightly. Maybe this wasn't about speaking perfectly. Maybe it was about sharing something meaningful. As this story ended, the American students encouraged the class to share something about their own culture. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different, less tense, more expectant. The protagonist's heart raced once more, but something inside them shifted. They wanted to speak. They needed to speak. Slowly they raised their hand, trembling slightly. The teacher noticed and nodded with encouragement. With a deep breath, the protagonist began to speak. Their voice was shaky, the words stumbling out awkwardly at first, but they pushed through. They shared a small story about a tradition in their family, something simple yet personal. As they spoke, the room grew quiet and all eyes were on them. When they finally finished, there was a moment of silence before the American students clapped, smiling warmly. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. The message had come across, and that was all that mattered. The protagonist sat back in their chair, their hearts still racing, but now for a different reason. It wasn't fear anymore. It was pride. They had done it. They had spoken in front of everyone, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, it had felt good. The call continued with more stories being shared and laughter filling the room, but the protagonist barely noticed. Their mind was still racing, but now it was filled with the realization that maybe, just maybe, they could do this. As the call came to an end, the teacher thanked everyone for participating, reminding the students that this was only the beginning. There would be many more calls to come, many more opportunities to connect and learn. The protagonist nodded, though the words barely registered. They were still basking in the glow of their small victory. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and that was enough for now. After the call, the classroom buzzed with chatter as students discussed their experiences. The protagonist listened quietly, still processing what had happened. The fear was still there, lurking in the background, but it no longer felt paralyzing. They had taken the first step. and that was what mattered. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time they felt like they might be able to walk it. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, the protagonists gathered their things and left the room, their minds still racing with thoughts of the future. There would be more calls, more chances to speak, and more opportunities to grow. It was a daunting prospect, but for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. They had made a connection, however small, and that was the first step toward breaking down the barriers that had always held them back. The morning after the first video call, the protagonist woke up with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The memory of sharing their story in front of both their classmates and the American students played on repeat in their mind. It had been a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. They had spoken up, something they had never thought they could do. But now came the challenge of maintaining that momentum. What if it had been a fluke? What if, next time, they stumbled over their words and froze? As the protagonist arrived at school, the usual sounds of students chatting and teachers preparing for their lessons filled the air. They walked slowly to class, trying to calm the growing nerves inside. Today was the second video call, and while the first had been a step forward, the pressure was now higher. Their classmate seemed a little more confident this time, exchanging stories of their experiences from the previous day. The protagonist stayed quiet, still processing their emotions. The teacher entered the room with her usual encouraging smile. "Good morning, everyone," she said. "Today is another opportunity for growth. Remember, it's not about perfection. It's about connection." The protagonist took a deep breath, trying to internalize the teacher's words. They had heard it before, but somehow it didn't make the anxiety disappear. Still, they knew they had to keep pushing forward. When the video call began, the screen once again filled with the faces of their American peers. The initial awkwardness from the first session seemed to have faded slightly, but the tension was still there. The protagonist watched as their classmates introduced themselves once again, this time with a little more confidence. It was their turn next. Heart pounding, they unmuted their microphone and spoke. Their words came out with less hesitation this time, though still filled with nervous energy. They shared another short story about their family, and to their surprise, the American students responded with interest and support. As the conversation continued, the protagonist began to feel a shift. The more they spoke, the less daunting the task of communicating in English became. They were still far from fluent, but each word felt a little easier to say than the last. The American students shared their own stories as well, and the cultural exchange deepened. The protagonists found themselves more intrigued by the differences and similarities between their lives and those of the American students. Slowly but surely the focus began to shift from fear of making mistakes to genuine curiosity about the people on the other side of the screen. After the call ended, the class was buzzing with energy. The students talked excitedly about what they had learned, about the new stories they had heard. The protagonist, too, felt a spark of pride. They had made it through another call without freezing up, without letting their fear take control. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And that was something worth celebrating. In the days that followed, the protagonist's thoughts returned again and again to the video calls. They found themselves replaying the conversations in their mind, thinking about what they had said and how they could improve. The fear was still there, lurking in the background, but it no longer felt overwhelming. There was now a sense of possibility, a feeling that maybe they could become more comfortable with English after all. The protagonist began to look forward to the next session, though with lingering doubt. Would their progress continue, or had they just been lucky so far? The third call came quickly, and this time the protagonist was more prepared. They had thought about what they wanted to say in advance, practicing the sentences in their head over and over. When it was their turn to speak, the words flowed a little more smoothly. Their confidence was still fragile, but it was growing like a small flame that needed careful tending. As the weeks passed, the virtual cultural exchange program became a routine part of the protagonist's school life. Each call brought new challenges, but also new opportunities for growth. The protagonist began to form a deeper connection with one of the American students, someone who shared their interest in music and literature. This friendship became a source of motivation. The more they communicated, the more the protagonist wanted to improve their English, not just for the sake of the program, but to build a stronger bond with their new friend. The conversations started to move beyond the surface-level introductions and simple stories. They began discussing deeper topics, like their dreams for the future and the challenges they faced in their respective countries. The protagonist found themselves opening up more than they had ever expected, sharing thoughts and feelings they had kept hidden for a long time. It was as if learning the language had unlocked a new way of expressing themselves, one that went beyond words. However, not every session was easy. There were still moments when the protagonist struggled with pronunciation or grammar, moments when they felt the familiar fear of failure creeping back in. During one particularly difficult call, the conversation had moved to a more complex topic, and the protagonist found themselves stumbling over words, unable to keep up. Their cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and for a brief moment they considered giving up altogether, but then something unexpected happened. One of their classmates, who had noticed the protagonist's struggle, leaned over and whispered words of encouragement. "You're doing great." Don't give up. The simple act of support was enough to keep the protagonist going. They took a deep breath and continued, stumbling through the conversation, but pushing forward nonetheless. By the end of the session, the protagonist felt drained, but also strangely empowered. It wasn't about speaking perfectly. It was about pushing through the discomfort, about showing up even when it was hard. Each small victory, each moment of overcoming fear, was a step forward in their journey. As the cultural exchange program continued, the protagonists' confidence grew steadily. They still had moments of doubt, but those moments no longer defined their experience. Instead, they began to see English not as an insurmountable barrier, but as a bridge to new friendships, new ideas, and new possibilities. It wasn't just about language anymore. It was about connection with others, and, most importantly, connection with themselves. The day came when the protagonist realized just how far they had come. During one of the calls, they found themselves engaged in a deep conversation, laughing with their American friends, forgetting for a moment that they were even speaking a second language. It was a breakthrough, one that filled them with pride and a newfound sense of confidence. For the first time, a long time, the protagonist felt truly hopeful about their ability to learn and grow. They had started this journey filled with fear and self-doubt, but now they saw a future where those fears no longer held them back. The road ahead was still long, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges, but for the first time they felt ready to face them. The days leading up to the next video call were filled with a new kind of tension. The protagonist, while feeling more confident after the previous calls, couldn't shake the sense that something was about to change. There had been progress, yes, but now the conversations were becoming more complex. The topics the students were discussing were no longer limited to light-hearted stories about traditions or hobbies. Instead, they were delving into deeper subjects like their goals, their dreams for the future, and the challenges they faced in their everyday lives. As the protagonists prepared for the next session, they felt a mix of excitement and fear. They had made it this far, but what if they couldn't keep up? What if the other students' English was improving faster than theirs? These thoughts swirled in their mind as they practiced their sentences in front of the mirror, trying to perfect their pronunciation. It was a familiar feeling, the pressure of not being good enough, but this time it was coupled with the desire to prove to themselves that they could do this. The day of the call arrived, and the classroom buzzed with nervous energy. The students were more comfortable with the technology by now, but the emotional stakes felt higher. The protagonist sat at their desk, waiting for the screen to light up with the familiar faces of their American peers. When the call connected, there were smiles and greetings exchanged, but the atmosphere felt different. The conversations that followed were less structured than before. The students were no longer just sharing stories. They were asking questions, seeking to understand more about each other's lives on a deeper level. One of the American students asked a question that caught the protagonist off guard. "What do you want to do in the future?" "What are your dreams?" It was such a simple question, yet the protagonist felt a wave of anxiety crash over them. They had never really thought about it, at least not in a way they could articulate in English. Their mind raced, searching for the right words, but everything felt jumbled and out of reach. The silence stretched on for a moment too long, and the protagonist's heart began to race. They could feel the eyes of their classmates on them, waiting for them to respond. Finally, they took a deep breath and began to speak, their voice shaky at first. I want to travel," they said slowly, carefully picking each word. "I want to see other places, learn about different cultures. I don't know exactly what I want to do yet, but I know I want to explore." The response wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that was enough. The American student smiled and nodded, sharing their own dreams in return. The conversation moved on, but the protagonist couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. They had stumbled, yes, but they hadn't given up. They had found the courage to speak, even when they didn't have all the answers. And in that moment, they realized that language wasn't just about knowing the right words. It was about expressing who they were, about sharing their thoughts and feelings, even when it was difficult. After the call ended, the protagonist stayed behind in the classroom for a few minutes, lost in thought. They felt a strange sense of relief mixed with pride. They had faced a fear that had been looming over them for weeks, and though it hadn't been easy, they had made it through. The experience left them feeling stronger, more capable of handling the challenges that lay ahead. In the days that followed, the protagonist found themselves reflecting on their journey so far. They had started this program filled with fear and self-doubt, but now they could see how far they had come. Each video call had been a small step forward, a chance to break through the barriers that had held them back for so long. The fear was still there, of course, but it no longer felt like an insurmountable obstacle. It was something they could face, something they could overcome with time and effort. The next video call arrived sooner than expected. This time the protagonist felt more prepared. They had spent hours practicing their English, rehearsing what they wanted to say and building up their confidence. When the call started, they joined the conversation with a sense of ease that had been absent in previous sessions. The topics were still challenging, but the protagonist no longer felt overwhelmed. They had learned to take things one step at a time, to focus on the connection rather than the perfection of their speech. As the session went on, something remarkable happened. The protagonist found themselves laughing, genuinely laughing, with their American peers. It wasn't forced or awkward, it was natural. They had reached a point where the language barrier didn't feel so daunting anymore. Yes, there were still mistakes, and yes, they still struggled at times, but those struggles no longer defined their experience. The friendships that had formed over the weeks were stronger than the fear of making mistakes. By the end of the call, the protagonist realized something important. They had been so focused on improving their English, on becoming fluent, that they had almost forgotten the real reason they had joined this program in the first place. It wasn't just about language, it was about connection. It was about learning from others, about sharing experiences, and about finding common ground despite the differences in culture and language. As they walked home from school that day, the protagonist felt a sense of peace that they hadn't felt in a long time. They knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time they felt like they were on the right path. They were no longer afraid of the journey ahead. Instead, they were excited to see where it would take them. That night, as they sat in their room, the protagonist thought back to the very first video call. They remembered the fear, the hesitation, the overwhelming sense of inadequacy. But now those feelings seemed distant, like a memory from a different time. They had grown, not just in their ability to speak English, but in their confidence, their self-assurance, and their understanding of what it meant to connect with others. The cultural exchange program had given them more than just language skills. It had opened their eyes to new possibilities, to new friendships, and to the realization that they were capable of so much more than they had ever imagined. And as they looked out the window at the night sky, they couldn't help but smile. The journey wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just beginning. The day of the big presentation arrived, and the atmosphere in the classroom felt heavy with anticipation. The protagonist had spent the entire week preparing, practicing the story they were about to share. They had rehearsed it in front of the mirror, to friends, even whispering the words to themselves before falling asleep each night. Despite all the practice, they still couldn't shake the nerves that twisted in their stomach as they sat at their desk, waiting for the call to begin. The teacher smiled at the students, offering words of encouragement as they set up the video equipment. "Remember, this isn't about perfection," she said softly. "It's about sharing a piece of who you are, connecting with others through your story." The protagonist nodded along with the rest of the class, but the words didn't settle the fluttering anxiety in their chest. They knew they had prepared, but now the moment had arrived, and they weren't sure if they were ready. The screen flickered to life, and once again the familiar faces of their American counterparts appeared. This time, however, the stakes felt higher. Each student would take a turn sharing a personal story in English, something meaningful to them, something that required more than just simple sentences. The protagonist's palms were sweaty as they watched their classmates go first, one by one. Some spoke confidently, others stumbled through their words, but the warmth and support from both sides of the screen were evident. There was applause after each story, smiles, and nods of encouragement. When it was finally the protagonist's turn, they took a deep breath and stood up. The classroom felt strangely quiet as they walked to the front, their legs feeling heavier with each step. The faces on the screen smiled back at them, waiting patiently. The protagonist's heart pounded in their chest, but they pushed through the fear. They had prepared for this. Now was the time to prove to themselves that they could do it. They began to speak, their voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. They shared a story about a family tradition, something that had been passed down for generations. As they spoke, the fear of making mistakes slowly melted away. It wasn't about the grammar, the perfect pronunciation, or the flow of the sentences. It was about sharing a part of themselves, and as they did, they saw the smiles on the faces of their classmates and their American friends. The protagonist finished their story and was met with a wave of applause, not just from their classmates, but from the American students as well. They felt a rush of relief and pride. They had done it. They had faced their fear, stood up in front of everyone, and shared something deeply personal in a language that had once seemed so daunting. After the presentation, the protagonist returned to their seat, still feeling the adrenaline coursing through their veins. The rest of the session passed in a blur, but one thing was clear: they had taken a major step forward. The fear that had once paralyzed them no longer felt as powerful. They had proven to themselves that they were capable of more than they had ever thought possible. The following days brought a new sense of confidence. The protagonist walked through the halls of the school with their head held a little higher, their steps a little lighter. The fear of speaking in English, while still present, no longer felt like an insurmountable barrier. Each day they found themselves speaking more freely, taking risks with new words and phrases. They still made mistakes, of course, but those mistakes no longer felt like failures. They were simply part of the process, part of the journey toward growth. The friendships they had formed with the American students deepened with each video call. The conversations, once formal and structured, became more relaxed, more personal. They laughed together, shared stories about their lives, and supported each other through the challenges of learning a new language. The protagonist found that they were no longer just learning English for the sake of the program. They were learning because they wanted to connect with their new friends, to understand them better, and to share more of themselves. One afternoon, after another successful video call, the protagonists sat in their room, reflecting on how far they had come. They thought about the first call, the overwhelming fear that had gripped them, and the voice inside their head that had told them they weren't good enough. But now that voice had quieted. It was still there, whispering doubts every now and then, but it no longer had the same power. The protagonist had learned to push past it, to focus on the connections they were making rather than the fear of making mistakes. As they sat there, they realized something important. Language wasn't just about words. It was about connection, about understanding, about sharing experiences with others. The fear of not speaking perfectly had once held them back, but now they understood that communication was about much more than that. It was about being vulnerable, about opening up to others and allowing them to see who you really were. With this newfound understanding, the protagonist felt a sense of peace. They knew that there would still be challenges ahead, that they would continue to stumble over words and struggle with grammar, but those challenges no longer felt like something to be feared. They were simply part of the journey, part of the process of learning and growing, and for the first time the protagonist felt truly excited about that journey. The cultural exchange program had given them more than just language skills. It had given them confidence, friendships, and a deeper understanding of themselves. As the program continued, the protagonist knew that they would keep learning, keep growing, and keep pushing themselves to be better. But now they faced the future with a sense of hope and excitement rather than fear. The protagonist closed their eyes for a moment, thinking about the next video call. There would be more stories to share, more connections to make, and more opportunities to grow, and they were ready for it. They had proven to themselves that they were capable of facing their fears and coming out stronger on the other side. As they looked out the window at the setting sun, they couldn't help but smile. The journey wasn't over yet, but they were ready for whatever came next. They knew that they would continue to stumble, to make mistakes, and to feel afraid at times. But now they also knew that they had the strength to keep going, to keep learning, and to keep growing, and that was enough. The final day of the cultural exchange program arrived sooner than the protagonist had expected. The past weeks had flown by, filled with moments of growth, laughter, and challenges that had once seemed impossible. Today's video call would be the last one, a time to reflect on everything they had learned and experienced. The protagonist sat at their desk, feeling a mix of emotions. They were proud of how far they had come, but there was also a sense of sadness. This program had become a part of their life, a space where they had faced their fears and grown in ways they hadn't anticipated. As the call began, the faces of the American students appeared on the screen, just as they had so many times before. But today, there was a different energy in the air. Everyone knew this was the last time they would gather like this, and it added a bittersweet feeling to the moment. The teacher welcomed everyone warmly, encouraging the students to take this opportunity to reflect on their journey and share what the program had meant to them. One by one, the students began to speak. Some shared funny stories about their first nervous attempts to communicate, while others talked about the friendships they had formed. As the protagonists listened, they couldn't help but think about their own journey. They remembered the first day, the overwhelming fear of speaking in front of everyone, the constant worrying about making mistakes. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now those fears seem distant, replaced by a sense of confidence they never thought possible. When it was the protagonist's turn to speak, they took a deep breath. "This program has changed me," they began, their voice steady. "At first I was terrified of speaking in English. I thought I would never be able to communicate the way I wanted. But over time, I realized that it wasn't about speaking perfectly. It was about connecting with others, about sharing who I am. And that's something I'll never forget." As they continued, the protagonist felt a wave of emotion wash over them. "I've learned so much, not just about English, but about myself. I've learned that I'm stronger than I thought, that I can face my fears and grow from them. And I've made friends here, people who I never would have met if it weren't for this program. For that I'm truly grateful." When they finished speaking, there was a moment of silence before the screen erupted in applause. The protagonist smiled, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. They had come so far, and now, standing at the end of this journey, they could see just how much they had grown. The rest of the call was filled with more reflections, laughter, and a few tears as the students said their goodbyes. The teachers reminded everyone that while this was the end of the program, it didn't have to be the end of their connections. They could stay in touch, continue to practice their English, and carry the lessons they had learned into their futures. As the call ended, the protagonist sat quietly for a moment, taking it all in. The room felt strangely still after the lively conversation that had just taken place. But instead of feeling sad, they felt a sense of peace. They knew that this was just the beginning. The program might be over, but the skills and confidence they had gained would stay with them for a lifetime. Over the next few days, the protagonists found themselves reflecting on the experience more and more. They thought about the friendships they had made, the challenges they had faced, and the victories, both big and small, that had marked their journey. It wasn't just about learning English anymore. It was about learning to believe in themselves, to take risks, and to keep pushing forward, even when things were difficult. One afternoon, as they sat by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the protagonist smiled. They had always dreamed of traveling, of seeing the world and learning about different cultures. And now, for the first time, that dream felt possible. The fear that had once held them back no longer had the same grip on them. They had faced it time and time again, and had come out stronger because of it. The protagonist knew that there would still be challenges ahead, Learning a language wasn't something that happened overnight, and there would always be moments of doubt and frustration. But now they had the tools to handle those moments. They had learned to be patient with themselves, to embrace the mistakes as part of the process, and to keep moving forward no matter what. As the days turned into weeks, the protagonists stayed in touch with a few of the American students. They sent messages, shared stories about their lives, and continued to practice their English. Each conversation was a reminder of the journey they had taken, and each message was a small victory in itself. The cultural exchange program had been a transformative experience, one that had reshaped the protagonists' view of themselves and the world. They had started this journey filled with fear and uncertainty, but now they faced the future with confidence and excitement. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time they felt ready to walk it. As the protagonist stood at the edge of this new chapter in their life, they couldn't help but feel grateful. Grateful for the friendships, the lessons, and the growth they had experienced. They knew that the journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. And with that thought, they looked out at the world with a smile, ready to embrace whatever came next.